Good morning. This is Sarah Botchus, your Chief Governmental Relations Officer at CASBO. But thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar, our CASBO Workwise webinar series with F3 Law. Joining me today is Kelley Owens, partner, Jessica Ehrlich from as well, and Tasha Davenport will not be with us today, but she's sending everyone well wishes as we continue with the beginning of this academic school year. Today's presentation topic is shedding light on school energy projects and procurement. Kelley, take it away.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for CASBO giving us this opportunity to share this information and an update on energy projects. My name is Kelley Owens. I'm a co-chair of the Business and Facilities Practice Group here at F3, and it is my privilege to be joined by Jessica Ehrlich, who is the co-chair of our Community Facilities District Practice Group, construction attorney, litigator extraordinaire, and just a really great person to go into any matter with. We've worked on a lot of things together last year, so definitely wanted her in here to talk on energy projects. Jessica's in our LA office. I'm in the San Diego office, and we just want to welcome you for joining. Thank you for coming, whether you're live or on the recording, because I know you guys are all busy reopening schools too. Just a couple housekeeping items before Jessica and I get going. There is, as you can see, a Q&A box. Sarah's going to be monitoring that Q&A, and we'll take the majority of those questions either at the end, or if we run out of time. The great part about this platform is we do have your contact information and can follow up and make sure you get your questions answered. So with that, I will jump in and just go over a few things that we're going to cover today. And if you look at this list here, and Jessica is going to be jumping in on all of these different things too, but if you look at this list, we really wanted to look at it from your perspective. You know, if attorneys were doing this, we'd have all of these things in different boxes, different presentations, but that's not how you get this information, and this is not how things are thrown at you in the real world. And so what we wanted to do is really address some high level things we're seeing, share some lessons learned, particularly on solar and energy efficiency projects after being in that field for over 10 years with school districts and seeing what we've seen. And then also share, particularly around the federal funding sources, what we're seeing on the horizon that will impact you from day to day. And so we'll get started here with, but really all of this is under the umbrella of energy projects. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll get started with where we always like to start. We even do this in our own meetings with reasons to celebrate. And this is reasons to celebrate schools, because in preparing for this presentation and looking at some of the more recent stats, the work that California schools have done in the energy efficiency and solar, when we talk about renewable energy sector from a nationwide standpoint, is incredible. You know, these are actually some older stats. So I'm sure it's even higher numbers now, but California schools comprise a third of the schools that have solar on their properties, a third of those in the entire nation. Schools are also hold, and the production of each of those is really high. 45% of the entire solar capacity across the nation at schools is in California. We also look to things like the Prop 39 program that has been going on for years now, and the cost savings from every school district is significant, where school districts have been able to use that money and make their buildings much more efficient. There's also reasons to celebrate looking to the future. Clean energy, renewable energy is certainly on the agenda in California, on the legislature's mind, and it's certainly there on the federal side as well. And so we'll get a little bit more into that and what we see coming.
And obviously,
oh, go ahead, Jessica. Yep.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the very nice intro, Kelley. And on the reasons to celebrate, I think, you know, Kelley really makes a good point that voters passed, particularly the Prop 39 legislation, when school districts receive these funds, utilize these funds for solar projects, and really, you know, those projects resulted in cost savings and increased energy efficiency that I think, you know, districts are seeing across the board. So those are certainly reasons to celebrate.
That's right. That's right. And with the reasons to celebrate, we're certainly not done. As we know, both the the political climate right now, but also just the climate overall, right? There's certainly a need, and again, I found an interesting stat brought up in an op-ed that was in the New York Times not too long ago, and it was talking about the federal infrastructure bill, which we'll touch on, but after one thing that I thought was interesting is after roads and highways, schools are the second largest infrastructure sector in the country. That blew me away a little bit. But when you ride on an airplane ever and you look down at California, I mean, the many of those giant swaths of land and big buildings, you can tell right away are schools, right? So you could imagine how that schools can be the second largest infrastructure, but they're in need of repair, they're in need of energy efficiency upgrades. We're also hearing, certain districts, many districts now have been moving towards net zero energy goals. And so again, that's with a focus on the future. We're certainly not done and want to expand our outreach to schools to make sure we can support them in their future endeavors. So let's get into the energy projects, and we can actually jump, Jessica, one more slide. And this is just to give you the lay of the land a little bit of then and now. I think for the last decade plus, we've really focused on things like energy efficiency projects and solar projects. That's where the funding was coming from. That's where the vendors were approaching school districts on. And those still continue, I think, particularly on the HVAC side and lighting. The efficiency of buildings as those buildings are upgraded and built continue to be a focus. But in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of things like COVID-related improvements, better filters for COVID protection, better filters for wildfire smoke. That's something that I know that school districts unfortunately are having to deal with on a daily basis. And then there's also, as we expand the scope of what does energy mean, energy storage, battery storage for more energy resiliency during even emergency times like wildfires. And then also things like e-buses. I mean, the movement towards alternative fuel busing is significant, and that technically falls under the scope of energy as well. So if anything, I'd say the common theme is really expansion of what energy projects mean and how school districts can utilize these tools to reduce their bottom line, but also become much more resilient from an energy perspective. So,
and I think also, Kelley, just to piggyback on that,
yes,
COVID has really pushed districts, towards more energy efficient, solar related type projects, having to have kids eat lunch outside and build, solar powered, covered lunch shelters that also create energy efficiency resources for districts, have also been a huge factor going forward that will probably, remain in place hopefully when we're all past COVID. And same thing with increased energy efficiency HVAC systems and MERV filters and just overall creating better air quality, for students at large. So we're moving in the right direction.
Right. And as Jessica sees in her construction world, new schools and rehab schools are being designed with those things in the front of mind rather than sort of side issues. You would have never had this much discussion about filters and efficiency of an AC and the power and all of that as you would now, given the world we're in. So let's talk a little bit about solar first. And this is an area near and dear to my heart because this is one of the areas where when I joined the firm, I worked closely with Kathy McKee, who, if you guys have been in the field for a while, she really was one of the attorneys on the forefront of getting solar at schools, both in PPA and, school-owned projects. And so I got to work very closely with her 10 plus years ago as we started helping those very brave school districts start to adopt solar. And over the time, we've been able to work with some really solid vendors. There's still many of them out there that I think a lot of the ones that have done well in this field really care about the schools. They get the school's perspective And also what's nice about solar projects, particularly on power purchase agreements, is it is a long-term relationship many times with vendors. And then also there's somewhat of a self-enforcement within a PPA, because if you build a solar array properly as a solar company under a PPA, it's going to produce more energy and benefit overall that production. And so those have created some good collaborative relationships with vendors over time. But that said, there are many lessons learned, especially from the early days where we were all sort of trying to figure things out. And there's still some issues of concern that when we hear from clients over and over again, this is what you guys are dealing with in the field. That's what we wanted to focus on and cover, so that if it comes up for you in the future as you continue to navigate these solar projects, you'll be ready. But I'm going to kick it back to Jessica, because I think on the issues of concern, she sees a lot as well in her practice. Jessica?
Thanks, Kelley. So yes, all the PPAs are great and they really provide a lot of benefit for the districts. But I think certainly many districts have experienced a lot of turnover with their vendors, whether it be, the vendor going bankrupt or out of business, and then assignment agreements come into play. So I think districts really want to be mindful to make sure that they're covered in the event of an assignment, and the underlying agreement and the original deal that was made still stands, and the same protections and obligations are guaranteed with any sort of assignment. And that kind of lumps in with any maintenance and operation obligations that the vendors have to a district, making sure that vendors follow the maintenance and obligation requirements that are in the underlying agreement, whether that be adapting to new ADA compliance laws or DSA regulations. And, all those agreements should have language in there that contemplates compliance with any applicable laws and regulations. We recently had a solar structure where they had issues with bird droppings all over the solar structure, but that was part of the underlying agreement, that the vendor was supposed to put spikes or to protect the structure in of itself. So we just want to hold the vendors to the obligations that they said that they would provide at the outset. And I think that's really important to getting the benefits of why districts entered into the PPAs and these solar arrangements to begin with.
Yeah, and a couple other things on this list that we see that have sort of evolved, or just like maintenance, where we learn how a project's going to evolve over time. And now that these projects have been in existence for quite some time, we're seeing it, where issues come up, like the location of solar arrays, where we had a district that had a successful bond program, which was amazing, but within that bond program promise was to expand a building on a high school site where solar had filled up most of the excess space. And so we needed to work with the company to relocate those solar arrays and make sure that the district could still fulfill its bond promise, while making sure it didn't mess up too much with its solar. But those are things that now we say, make sure you cover that very clearly in your agreements up front, because the chance that you may have to relocate your solar arrays, whether you build out or you sell property. I mean, we're helping districts all the time now sell surplus property. And if you have a 20-year PPA, 25-year PPA on that property, that could be an issue. So things like that keep coming up, we just want to raise your awareness about. Couple pitfalls we've seen that, even though at the very beginning we've been sort of talking about this, helping clients with these issues, just wanted to revisit things in case you're jumping into a new solar project now, or redoing your contracts to add new solar, or to existing sites. Things that we've seen in PPAs that particularly caused some problems is where we get these contracts after the fact, and there's this big, beautiful contract where talks about installation of solar, but the language fell short on really holding that solar vendor to making sure they could connect the system to the utility and work with the utility to actually make sure that that array is functional and connected to the grid. And you'd be surprised how difficult at times different utilities are to work with, particularly smaller local utilities. We're sort of, we and the vendor are at their really at their discretion. And so having some strong language to make sure that if you're going to build out this system, it does what it's intended to do on the grid. Other things is so much of the time where we get contracts after the fact, they are very vendor driven, and the vendor has provided the contract, and it may be a counsel for the company that's in a completely different state, sometimes a different country, and they may not know California law as well. And so making sure that the contract is revised with California Ed Code requirements in mind, Government Code 4217 in mind, which we'll cover. And just on one more thing that just really continues to come up, I'm not sure why, if we go to the next slide, is roof mounts.
And before we go to roof mounts, Kelley,
yes.
I just want to chime in here and say, I think, the overall lesson is when you're first entering into one of these agreements to really spend some time making sure that protections are there for the district, and to not let, the vendors railroad you with, their agreement or their provisions. Certainly we can always push back and, try to find a meet in the middle, because it really pays off down the road. And I think in the event we're stuck with an agreement that maybe isn't ideal, there are usually, Kelley and I can put our heads together and come up with creative ways to still, find the language we need. So I think, the agreement and keeping copies of every iteration of the agreement, assignments, guarantees, is really important to making sure the district can protect itself and get what it bargained for. So now we can move on to roof mounts.
That's a great point. But of course you reminded me of something, Jessica. So many of you out there may have inherited PPAs from years ago, and you had no hand in them. And one thing I always recommend to clients is if you're approached to amend anything in an agreement, it's always a good time to check in with counsel, even if it's just to amend the scope, or you have an assignment. There's always opportunities to potentially fix language or add new language to clarify based on lessons learned. And so you may get a simple amendment in front of you and think, okay, let's just go ahead. But it's always nice to check in and see, are there other things we want to loop into this as well. Roof mounts, just quickly, I think most of the folks I talk to, we generally advise to stay away from roof mounts on solar, but as footprints of schools get smaller, land is more scarce, we see this continue to come up. And again, rooftop mounts by themselves with solar panels are not immediately terrible. We've just seen way more issues with them, and increased costs, withdrawing from the contract by solar vendors sometimes because it was a district building issue. Sometimes they're not covered by your insurance company to put them on existing roofs. There's drainage issues. So I would just say have extra caution and always keep an eye out if you have a new solar proposal or you're adding solar. If there's a roof mount proposed, always ask those additional questions about the things on this list and beyond. And it's always something as counsel we're looking out for too. Just a word on that, since we continue to see that come up. We'll hit on a few more lessons learned, and Jessica, feel free to jump in here, because I know you've dealt with some of this both on just the regular transactional and also potentially litigation side of things. We've already talked about relocation and sale. A few years back, we navigated a few bankruptcies of solar vendors with districts where you have this long-term agreement, but the company on the other side of the agreement is going through a massive restructuring where they're selling assets off, and the majority of the time we were able to treat a lot of them because they're valuable assets and because they were functioning. We were able to treat them as assignments of the project, just as we would in other circumstances. But where that went the best and worked out best for the school district is where the agreements contemplated bankruptcy ahead of time and provided provisions, and also included provisions for legal fees should you have to assign anything. The districts were able to get, they had already negotiated this agreement. It was supposed to be a turnkey system, so they did not need to pay a bunch of legal fees to help out this company that went bankrupt. And so we had provisions in our contract that required the vendor to actually pay the legal fees for that process, and that seemed to work out very well, even though it wasn't always the ideal situation for the district to have to do it. Again, we do continue to hear stories of angry neighbors where someone goes out in their backyard one day and the solar arrays have gone up and it's blocking their entire view and it looks like it's coming into their backyard. I mean, those are things that we always recommend when you're interviewing for an RFP for vendors. You know, how invested are the vendors in the community outreach, in making sure thoughtfully that if you're putting a bunch of arrays in a parking lot or if you're putting them on a hillside, that it's not going to cause long-term headaches for the school districts. And again, we continue to see with solar, particularly some procurement requirements and needing to refresh clients' memories on how to go about that. And so we're going to get into that a little bit as well. But Jessica, do you want to cover the next slide on or anything more on this list that you've seen?
Sure. I would just say with, part of the angry neighbors and CEQA component of this, I think the key is really, like Kelley mentioned, community outreach, both on the part of the vendor and the district. Notice and then, informing your district community is really key at the outset. And, that goes a long way. If you involve the community, they have input, you're likely to end up with a much more successful, smooth, project. And as far as procurement, we will spend a lot of time on that as well. And to just make sure we're following all the procurement requirements, because no one wants to end up in an audit situation, and that we'll definitely cover that here in the second half. And then we're going to move right into other Government Code 4217 energy projects. And for me, the name of the game is really a competitive process. Even if the funding source might not directly require a competitive process, most of them do, especially if you're getting state or federal funding. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a low bid that you put out on the street, but some sort of competitive process, usually an RFP process, or just the fact that we're contacting multiple vendors to get pricings and find out what kind of program that they can perform. And the funding source is really key to that, because that's really what's going to set forth the guidelines and help districts avoid lengthy, expensive audits from whoever's providing that funding, whether it be on a state or federal level. And then I think, Kelley, you want to talk about the cost savings?
Sure. And really the reasoning behind this slide is I think so many clients out there have been very familiar with Government Code 4217 in the context of solar. And when you have, solar arrays producing a ton of energy, 4217 is that provision that basically says you can move forward and select a vendor without the traditional bid process, provided you make certain findings. And the biggest one is cost savings, where you have to make a finding as with your board. Your board, actually, we recommend passing a resolution that does this, where you say the anticipated cost of the project will be outweighed by the anticipated savings of the project. Now, in a solar arrangement where the other company is building the arrays and the district simply buying the energy back at a reduced cost, the ability to show those cost savings is usually fairly easy, and you get a good, strong, high number. What we're seeing now is some vendors and districts, and this is okay, are expanding the use of Government Code 4217 to cover other types of energy work, like HVAC work, where you bootstrap HVAC with lighting projects, and then you're able to still show your cost savings. But it seems to me, as we get into those other non-solar type projects, that we start to get a little bit away from the clean implementation under Government Code 4217, and that's just what we're seeing out in the field. And I think when it comes to projects as expensive as HVAC, it's really good to make sure that you are running this through council, potentially running your cost savings through a third party consultant expert, because sometimes it's very convenient to use 4217, but those requirements still do apply. And on the next slide, there's a few that you can just take with you to keep in mind, because we still cover this a lot when it comes to the selection of the company, that Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead one. So is we still need to use, or we recommend an RFP. And even though 4217 doesn't speak directly to this, I can speak to the fact that the districts I have worked with where we come in and negotiate the contract after they have selected their vendor and they didn't do a full RFP process, it becomes much more difficult to negotiate the terms. It's much harder to get vendor buy-in over time. And part of the reason I think is because when you have, as Jessica said, a competitive process where you're at least comparing 2 or more vendors, that winning vendor knows there's another one just waiting in the wings, at least one other one waiting in the wings to make sure that we are happy with how things are going. And so that's why, even though it's not necessary under 4217, we always recommend it. And also it allows you to utilize the expertise of the competing vendors with your questions about your solar sites or how they would implement things. And again, it's almost like you're adding a layer of due diligence up front by doing an RFP. But Jessica, anything further on this that you've seen out there?
Yes, I would say, so we definitely encourage doing a competitive process. You're going to hear Kelley and I say that over and over again during our time together. And whether that be through an RFP or just, contacting multiple vendors, I think a logistical key there is make sure everything is done in writing. Make sure if you're reaching out to vendors, you're sending emails and not just picking up the phone, which you can certainly follow up that way, but you really want to have a paper trail of this competitive process. And if you receive quotes from vendors, you want that to be them to submit that in writing. And that's why an RFP proposal really lends itself to that. And also, if there's going to be multiple phases to a project, each phase needs to be either incorporated into that competitive process RFP, or you really want to, if you want to do it separately. So if there's a planning phase and implementation phase, it's really important that all phases are done through a competitive process. And interviews are also possible. If you want to sit down and meet with other vendors, that's a possibility. And I know sometimes districts are approached by vendors saying you can use 4217 and that's, you're not required to do this competitive process, and that's accurate. But you really want to check your funding sources and make sure there's no nuance there that it has to be done through a competitive process. So in the end, I think it just as an extra layer of protection when you procure your vendors for these projects.
Right. And one thing on this list too, especially we mentioned battery storage. Districts now more and more are looking at battery storage as an option to do in conjunction with their solar project. And we do see these batteries, the science was a little unknown a few years ago. Now they're become much more efficient, reliable. And so often we'll recommend to a district have the vendors draw up 2 different scenarios, one with battery storage, one without, so you can compare and contrast what is the true cost savings over time with that type of option. Now we'll get into a little bit more of these requirements, because I do think that, again, you're dealing with a million different things as in your role on the business side at school districts. And so this is something that if we can make your lives just a little bit easier, we'll mention it now. 4217 is incredibly flexible when it comes to the selection of the vendors, but there are some requirements like that cost savings findings I mentioned, and also public notice. This is one that continues to get folks, and I get it. Public notice needs to be published 2 weeks prior to the board meeting. And so that the bare minimum of that is publishing it on your website and in places where your district board agenda is usually located. Newspaper publication, some districts choose to do that. That's not a hard requirement any longer, but it's always the best practice to get it out there. And when we do adopt these projects, they need to be done in regular open session. And again, we have sample resolutions, sample notices that we work with districts on and make their lives a little bit easier. But there is a hearing that needs to be held actually. So in a separately agendized public hearing to open and close for public comment on the project. And this is often one thing that we point to if they're later, let's say a year into the project, the solar vendor has done proper outreach, the community has known about it, and someone does come and has an issue with it, we often can point back to this very cleanly done process to say, hey, this was publicly noticed, this was our project, and there was a public hearing. So it actually acts as a somewhat of a level of protection for school districts there too.
And as
So
we move into kind of give an overview of best practices,
perfect.
I think with all public works, procurement, and contracting, the idea is it an open, competitive, transparent process? And,
Yeah.
and that's the same mindset to have going through these types of projects as well. And my motto usually for construction projects is when in doubt, bid it out. And that's, you know, there's some loopholes here, but I think that's what the focus is to make sure we have a transparent, competitive process.
And really this slide, we've covered a lot of this already. These are just some best practices that as we reflect on these projects that we've helped districts with 10 years in, whether it's solar, HVAC, energy efficiency. These are things that we found that may not be written into the law, but they certainly help to look at. Things like getting a third-party vendor to come in and review your numbers, particularly on a big project, particularly on a project where the district's actually buying the panels. You know, early communication with stakeholders, that involves obviously your community, but also your individual board members. We've been to board meetings where there were one or two very vocal board members that waited until and didn't necessarily have the opportunity until the public hearing meeting to express their concerns about the solar project, and at times that has really disrupted the process and caused the board to take a pause, where it was more so about answering questions ahead of time and educating the board members on the program and the protections that were involved, rather than risks that seemed to be greater than they were willing to tolerate. So that includes your board. Oftentimes these projects can just get pushed through very quickly, but I recommend, you know, checking in with your board and making sure that they're comfortable with the cost savings projections and questions that they have. And we've already covered a lot of these other things. I'd say, you know, when it comes to security in your PPAs, that continues to be an issue, whether Jessica mentioned, you know, the conditions of the panels from vandalism or people throwing rocks, or, you know, those maintenance obligations, who's going to handle that when, will apply right at the beginning of your project, but could also apply 15 years down the road. So just make sure those contracts very clearly lay out who's going to cover what when things do happen. And so with that, that's really Solar 4217 in a nutshell. But Jessica mentioned there are other funding sources for programs. And when the money comes in from a different source or specialized type of programs, that can really trip up districts. And if there's one takeaway from this section coming up, and you'll hear it now again and again, it's follow the money. Follow the money. And we've seen that come up with two particular California energy efficiency programs that we'll talk about right now. But we'll talk about some new money first, and Assembly Bill 841. This is a relatively new bill, and I've been talking to a number of districts about this funding source. And I understand, rightfully so, some districts are hesitant about this funding source because of what we're going to talk about in the second part of this section. But AB 841 does promise a new program, a new funding source, particularly for underserved communities, for specific type of energy efficiency improvements and other type infrastructure improvements. The majority of the funding is for ventilation. So things like HVAC upgrades, filter upgrades, things that are going to help a district reopen in the COVID era, whether it's, you know, inefficient or broken systems. We've had many districts that installed filters either to find out the filters weren't the right ones or harmful, or that they installed filters that were so good that their air conditioning system couldn't necessarily handle it, and now they're looking for a new funding source to upgrade that air conditioning system. AB 841 does provide funding for this. It's targeted funding only for a 3-year period, We'll see if that gets extended, but the initial funding that's going to be available will give priority to underserved communities. That's typically, and the guidelines define it. We don't need to go into it full here, but it's typically around your free and reduced lunch programs and other certain percentages. If your district hits that mark for other programs, it'll likely hit that mark for AB 841. The California Energy Commission is charged with running this program. It's a new program there. Guidelines, it took a while for the guidelines to come out. I know there were lots of organizations that submitted comments to those guidelines. They are available online through the California Energy Commission. They are pretty broad. They don't have too much instruction on procurement practices and defer mainly to the district's methods of procurement and the state laws and guidelines, which, as we'll talk about in the second section, could potentially create some pitfalls for our districts. But it's just, a big thing about this is just have some practical considerations with this and proceed with caution. And so I'll kick it to Jessica to share her thoughts on what we were talking about over and over again, which is follow this money with these types of programs.
Sure. And I just want to mention on the California Energy Commission, Kelley and I have found them to be a really great resource and very supportive of the districts in implementing these projects. And, I think if there are questions, that, if you don't have access to your legal or whoever it may be, but just using the California Energy Commission as a resource is helpful. I do that. If I have a question, I pick up the phone, we call CEC and say, what do you think? What's the policy? So I think, sometimes just picking up the phone gets you the answer you need. But moving on to some practical considerations, as our theme for this next part is follow the money. Identify what the procurement standards are for the AB 841 dollars, and whether that's saying, don't do sole sourcing like in Prop 39 that we'll talk about, or it says follow the district's own policies and procedures regarding procurement. We just want to pay real special attention to that. And then I think that's a good time to look at what are your district's policies and procedures regarding procurement standards. What are you requiring for a competitive process? And that really is the key to having a successful program, that you don't get hit up at the end with an audit letter saying, hey, return all the money that you already spent. And a lot of that's going to come down to making sure that you follow the procurement standards.
Yeah, and two things we're seeing with AB 841 that make it right for potential audit later is, one, whenever there's a potential new funding source for money, both districts and vendors get very excited about it, but before guidelines are out there and very clear, you'll have people approaching board members or districts with new projects or funding sources. And when it's a little bit less clear, it's always good to have the district vet whatever the vendor is saying. Have legal counsel look at, all right, what are they relying on here? Are they just relying on 4217 government code, even though there might be a different funding source for the project? Because again, even if you have some flexibility under one statute like 4217, you may actually still need to follow a more specific, restrictive, competitive process for a different program, for a different state funded program, such as AB 841. The other thing that complicates this a little bit is districts are able to start planning and implementing these projects before the AB 841 money comes in. And so there's some circumstances where districts have already started and paying for estimates and paying for work before actually securing the funding. And while that gives you a little bit more flexibility, that could potentially cause an issue if that was done and then the money gets held up. And so what we used to write into our Prop 39 contracts, and we recommend writing into these contracts, is the project is contingent on the state funding coming through. There's some sample language we use in most of our contracts and recommend that be there. So we've been I want to jump to Prop 39 because I know we've sort of been talking about it as this mysterious thing, and it's only because Jessica and I have really lived through these audits now with districts, and we wanted to share some of our experiences. But I'll give it to Jessica because she's been tremendous in helping districts in this area.
Thanks, Kelley. Ditto. So, one of the things I think that Kelley and I have it's become our personal mission to help districts going through Prop 39 audits is, overall, the voters passed this legislation to give districts money to implement solar and energy efficiency projects. The districts paid vendors, did implement those projects, and are now actually seeing the benefits of those projects. And then what's happening at the back end is districts are getting audited for various things, primarily based on the procurement method used. And as opposed to, I think, a lot of audits as districts see where you might face the penalty, these audits are requesting a full return of funds that have already been spent. So it's not, some of these audits are upwards of, $5-6 million, and that $5-6 million is gone. So that's why Kelley and I've really been, I think, paying attention to procurement, methods and what the funding source requires. The primary Prop 39 audits are relying on what they're saying district used sole sourcing. So let me show you what that is. The Prop 39 audits are relying on a definition of sole sourcing from the Public Resource Code. And I think the interesting thing to note is most of the people enforcing the audits, specifically the State Controller's Office, the Department of Finance, don't really know what sole sourcing means, don't know what a competitive bid process is. To them, they just think you have to do a low standard design bid build, low bid type project. And that's not really the case. And for a lot of us in facilities and construction, when we hear sole source, we're thinking Public Contract Code 3400, if I want to put the same TV in every classroom or, use the same PA system. So it's been very unclear what sole sourcing means. The people enforcing it don't even know what it means. But that's why from the outset, it's so important to just use a competitive process, because what we want to do is defend against the audits so districts aren't returning this money that they've already spent. So I think that that's really a key. Kelley, did you want to add anything here?
Sure. If we just jump to the next slide, I think when we talk about when we're brought into a district through an audit, and this should inform not just your Prop 39, and if these audits are ongoing, so definitely remain diligent and let us know if something comes up for you, because we've been navigating this a lot. But if we come in and we're looking at your records, and it's very important to have the records available, what we're looking for is in line with what State Controller's Office is at least telling us, even minimally, what they want to see. And ultimately, do you have documentation or some sort of record from a board meeting, from phone calls, to support that the district considered more than one vendor when it awarded the contract? And as we know with these Prop 39 projects, it was sort of the wild, wild west, and not everything is going to be perfectly clean and in line with many of these projects, but that's ultimately what the auditors are looking for. And so both for your Prop 39 projects, make sure you're retaining all of those documents in the event of an audit, but also for whether it's AB 841 or some of the other project funding sources we'll talk about, making sure that you create a clear story of what you did, and always have an eye on, are we looking at multiple vendors? Are we using that competitive process that Jessica talked about? And really on the last slide, it's just what we're looking at the most is, whereas it wasn't a perfect process, it was very unclear with Prop 39 at the beginning, districts are still being held to the standard. And so what we've pointed to is this Education Code section 41344.1, which is if you can show good faith through documentation, if you can demonstrate that, for example, one great point Jessica's made in districts is the district used the money as planned. It's not like they were throwing it on a roulette table in Vegas. I mean, they definitely used it to implement energy efficiency projects in the school districts. And so that's one area that if you can provide documentation, you have that record of good faith compliance, that will help. But yeah, we're not out of the clear yet. we're even seeing districts that are missed one audit year, got through that, but then now if the auditor sees something in one particular fiscal year, may potentially be looking at prior years of implementation as well. So anything on that, Jessica?
Yeah, there's a couple of practical tips, we wanted to share about navigating these audits. Just because you receive a letter that says we're auditing you and want you to return the funds, that's certainly not the end of the road. I would say that's the beginning. And a lot of times the state controller's office and Department of Finance come at districts with, well, we'll let you pay it over time. Well, that's not really a great, option if I have to return the money from our general fund anyway. So these are definitely, you can certainly fight against them. You can definitely prevail. Kelley and I have had some really great success. The more documentation you have and the better we handle the audit process at the outset, I think the more opportunity for success. So I think that means involving, legal early as soon as you get notice of the audit, gathering all available documentation, all correspondence, emails, and, really gearing up to put up a fight against these audits. And I think in the end, we've had really great results with districts not having to return, all of the money that's been spent. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to prevent an audit, and then what to do, should an audit happen. And that's what we're really trying to, provide some insight on.
Yeah, and we've learned a lot though by seeing what happens when there is a unclear program. I mean, it started with very good intentions. The objective is clear, to put more energy efficiency in schools with a funding source. But when that's, very unclear, gray area in the beginning, it's not always guaranteed that that'll be treated that way on the audit phase. The audit phase tends to look at it and say, well, you should have known this, and it should have been very clear. And so we've seen that with Prop 39, and it's interesting to look at something like AB 841, because we start to see that same pattern start to happen again. And so if we can share those lessons learned from what we're seeing on Prop 39, even if it's for your new funding sources like AB 841 or some of the federal sources we'll cover, to keep those procurement standards in mind, keep the documentation as a priority for your district, because you could be living the same thing later with AB 841. And we do have a news flash available on that new AB 841, and it will go out when CASBO shares the recording of this program. We'll make sure that's included there, and you can always contact our firm for that, because we want to be with districts from the beginning implementation again, so we're not seeing the same history repeat itself with this new program.
Yeah, I mean, the
overarching
point, I think, is we're all local and state agencies using public monies, and we're all trying to act in good faith to implement whatever programs or run our districts. And that's the part we really, work to get across when we receive these audits, with the state, because we're also, local agencies just acting in good faith. And like Kelley said, it's not like we called up our buddy and said, hey, come implement this project. We're all doing the best we can and, trying to follow the appropriate standards. So that brings us into federal funding.
Yes, and then our practice group, looking on the horizon, this is one of the areas that we've seen grow in questions coming from school districts, both with the COVID and CARES Act implementation, but also seeing what might be coming on the federal level from Congress. And right now there's a bit of so right now we have the CARES Act that we're helping districts navigate. A lot of the things on this list go to programmatic changes or expanding distance learning and making sure kids catch up on the curriculum side, but also included in this, particularly around the ESSER programs. Those are continuing now till September 30th of 2022, which means there's a funding source for things like infrastructure improvements, primarily HVAC. And so again, follow the money. You might have a huge HVAC program at your school that's being funded from multiple sources. And as we've covered, it could be a funding source from the district or a bond. It could be a funding source from your energy efficiency programs, AB 841 coming in. And then now you have this federal money. And this funding source dictates your procurement, it dictates contractual requirements. And so we could go into a whole nother presentation on federal procurement and guidance. That's for a different day, but it's mostly just to raise awareness about what's coming. So for example, President Biden has talked about investing $100 billion to upgrade school infrastructure, and that the multi-trillion potentially infrastructure bill that's working its way through Congress does provide for things like upgrading buses to alternative fuels for school districts, making more energy efficient buildings. So the money's out there and the money's potentially going to continue to come. And so with that, districts may be getting approached by vendors with a project proposal that incorporates federal monies that are out there. And the second that happens, if there's a federal grant involved, we immediately started talking about this guy named Edgar. And it's actually, Edgar is a program. It's the federal regulations that govern the expenditure of federal funds awarded by the Department of Ed. And it basically says that it has a whole nother world of requirements for the expenditure of these projects. And the way that these requirements work is they depend on 3 different thresholds of amounts. Similar to California, how you have bid limits and different thresholds. Well, the federal guidelines have their own limits. And those were recently raised higher because of COVID. But the majority of your solar projects that are being funded, HVAC, they'll probably still fall into the formal purchases that require the full scope of Edgar requirements. There are some on this list within even the federal context. There are some exceptions that you may hear now and then where we've seen a lot come up in the emergency context. So technically, if you're using federal funds, just like in state funds, there's some exemptions to competitive bidding and all of that in emergency situations, which Jessica's going to cover. But still, even in those exception situations, I would say even more so on the federal side, the procedural and documentation requirements for the use of federal funds tend to be even more robust than the state. And so if you are trying to get around bidding in an emergency situation, or if you think you have a sole source situation for a type of a particular type of technology, anything like that, using CARES Act funds or any of the new federal funding that might come through, it's very important to be careful about what exceptions you're trying to use. And again, it's nice because the federal guidance sort of reiterates this message we've been harping on somewhat, is when in doubt, bid it out, or when in doubt, use the most restrictive, most conservative rule that applies. And maybe Jessica, if you want to go through on some of the emergency provisions and emergency exceptions, we can illustrate how that plays out. But a lot of times you'll have different procedures and protocols between federal and state, and we recommend always, and it's in the federal guidelines too, always go with the more restrictive, more strict bidding requirements. But let's talk a little bit about emergency exceptions before we wrap up.
Yes, so unfortunately, I'm sure all business and facilities folks have become much more familiar with emergency exceptions in the past year and a half, outside our standard public contract code emergency provisions. Some of that's through Governor Newsom's state orders and emergency declarations, as well as federal emergency declarations. And I think, a lot of districts have relied on those. And, we've advised quite a few clients about how to handle that. And, sometimes can you rely on an emergency order, a public contract code section, or both? I think that's important to determine at the outset, because we want to have as much support for whatever it is we're trying to procure, whatever project we're trying to implement. And so we really want to identify what that public exigency or emergency is And it kind of goes with everything. We still want it to be an open, transparent process. And if we can add some layer of competitiveness to it, even better. Can we get a few quotes from some different vendors to show we tried to make a competitive process without doing a full-on RFP or bidding model? And we really want to illustrate, why is this an emergency? Why would there be delay, and why would any sort of delay harm the district and whatever it's trying to do? I think in the race to reopen schools, there's been a lot of HVAC air filter projects that have happened. There's been a lot of procurement of safety equipment and materials that have fallen under this. So, these provide a lot of protections for the district and give a lot of options. But I think it's just important to cover your bases, and we provide some of those elements here that we want to include, whether that's sent through a board resolution or just making sure we have an open, transparent process.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not seeing too many questions, so I'd love for us to cover our key takeaways real quick, Jessica, before we go. You want to take the first two bullet points? You want to take those first two?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So I think we can all say we should have renamed our presentation "Follow the Money." So know your funding sources. That really is key. How are you supposed to be implementing these projects? Is it your own policies? Are there certain nuances like no sole sourcing? And if they say that, what does that mean in the context of that certain legislation? So it's really key to know your funding source at the outset, regardless of what a vendor might tell you. It's worth making that extra step to double check it. And then, competition is also the name of the game. Even if it's not required, having a competitive process is always a best practice. Kelley, you want to finish us off?
Yes, I think, just keep in mind, and these are key takeaways from seeing these projects over time. And now we've had the benefit of seeing what happens over time too, not just current needs when you're trying to get solar on a site, but also your future needs. What are you going to be doing with that property in 10, 15 years? Are you going to sell it? Are you going to need to move the arrays at some point? All of those things that are a challenge to think, not just what's right in front of us, but what's going to happen down the road. And a board member put this perfectly the other day. These types of projects are legacy projects, meaning two things. One, the impact of an energy project is going to have tremendous legacy for your district over time in the form of cost savings, contribution to the environment, potential learning opportunities for students for years to come. But it's also potentially a legacy that you leave for future board members, future administrators to navigate 10, 20 years from now. And so that's why we're so passionate about this topic. And we know they're not easy, a lot of gray area. And so we are here for you to support you with this guidance. But with that, those are our key takeaways, and happy to cover any questions if there's any more that you'd like to add to the chat.
And while we wait, I just wanted to make sure that we thank you in advance. This was a great topic and a great conversation. When we discussed it a few months ago, given the dynamics that as a particular school district was experiencing of potentially facing having to refund and return those dollars that have already been spent. And so we recognize that there may be some opportunities for us to go back, work with the legislature to get some of these definitions cleaned up. In the meantime, we offer that you have our contact information. This webinar, you will receive one CEU, one credit for this course. Please feel free to contact Michelle Neto. There is one question that just popped out in the queue, so I'll go ahead and pivot to that. But Michelle Neto's email is here on this slide deck, just in case. So the question comes from Eric. What is the best way to keep track on the newest and upcoming and existing grants? Thanks.
That's a great question, Eric, because we even struggle with that, I'll admit. Couple of resources that have been helpful from the state side, that, as Jessica mentioned, the California Energy Commission has a great and informative website on California programs. The one plug I'll put in, because I see updates all the time from them on two sources, is both School Services does a really good job of the updates on potential funding sources, especially on the federal side, for things like infrastructure improvements and CARES Act monies. So make sure you're subscribed to them. Just, I see their updates come through and they're even helpful for us. And also I think FCMAT puts out guidance as well on that, and CASBO too. CASBO, I think, does release federal funding updates and just in their regular news sources. And I think a lot of the attention on the federal side is on right now the $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And there's been some good coverage on that, but I would say just stay tuned to more of your support organizations like CASBO and like School Services and like FCMAT to really see what the latest is funding sources. I know also CASH, the Coalition for Adequate School Housing, that's definitely, they're on top of the funding sources as well. So there are groups out there that are more secondary sources of information, but can be good ways to summarize what's the latest. But there are a lot of sources of monies, but those are really the entities that I look to for my information. Jessica, any other ones that you can think of?
No, I think you covered it. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us. And we hope this information was useful. And please feel free to contact us if there's anything we didn't answer or questions that come up later. And it's been, you know, a real pleasure to share this information. And we want everyone to have very successful audit-free energy and solar projects.
That's right. That's right.
Yes, we do. That is the goal. So with that, this webinar is recorded. We will include the news flash as part of it when you get it released later on this week. Tomorrow, we're having another CASBO WorkWise webinar event with Lozano Smith on legal updates regarding vaccinations, which is a hot topic. And then next Wednesday at 10 in the morning, our next topic is the evolution of student discipline and equity. So we hope that you could continue to join us. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Sarah.
Thanks to
Thanks,
CASBO.
everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.